pure reason should be divorced from emotion. It should exist in its own right, even when you're not emotional.
I'm going to ask Tommy about pure reason.
Yeah, I'm lost on that distinction.
I saw a reason to stop drinking, right? I saw a reason to stop drinking too much. Reason told me I love drinking, I drank loads, but reason I couldn't ignore the evidence anymore. This was going to kill me, right? What's the problem with that? It's going to kill you, so what? Well, I care about not dying, right? Is that rational? Is it rational to care about not dying? I mean, in a sense, it sounds, well, of course it is, but no, it isn't, because, there are certain traditions which say we should be indifferent to death. There are philosophers who tell you that death shouldn't matter to you. It doesn't matter at all. So it's not like it's irrational to want to be happy to die. It's neither rational nor irrational. We want to live. So it's difficult to think of an example where you say...
Shall I give you one?
Yeah, give me one, yeah. I thought you'd think of one, yeah.
So I mean, the philosopher John McDowell often says, you see someone in need, and that gives you a reason to act. It doesn't mean that you'll be motivated to do it. Sometimes we walk away. Sometimes we feel very bad, and sometimes we know that we haven't had the desire to do it, but you had a claim on you to act when someone was in need.
Oh well, okay, but that's okay, but that's true. But you're distinguishing between seeing a reason and that being a motivation. The point is, any individual reason by itself isn't a sufficient reason to act, right? So you have reasons to help someone.
He thinks it is, but it doesn't mean you can't overcome it by your bad attitude.
Well, it's not just bad. I mean, you have a reason to help, you have a reason not to help, you've got an appointment, etc., etc. You have to make a judgment about which of these reasons is a more important reason to act. Now, it doesn't seem to me that by rationality alone, you're going to be able to conclude that one thing is a better reason than another, because rationality alone can't tell you why it's bad that you're just taking the purely selfish reasons to override it. I mean, let's say I'm a monster. I see someone in need, they're dying, but I'm actually really looking forward to my coffee, so I can't be bothered. I've got a reason to continue and walk by, and I've got a reason to help. I choose the reason to go and have the coffee. That makes me a horrible person. It doesn't make me irrational, does it? There's nothing irrational about that. It's just monstrous, and they're different.
I think you would be irrational for John McDowell, but there you are.
But would that be a reason, or would that be an emotion that's driving that? Again, this is just sort of my understanding of the world. But I think that emotions come first, always, because my perception of the world as a biological entity means that that's how I perceive it. So in that moment when you see the homeless person, but you want your coffee, the decision to help somebody is to do with empathy. It's to do with that moment of an emotional engagement. All the reasons are there. I don't have to see the homeless person to know they exist to do something, right? So actually, I mean, when you were talking a moment ago, Julian, I was thinking that's really funny, because when the pandemic started, nobody saw anything, nobody really heard anything personally, but we were given reasons, right? We were told, here is a reason, science says X, Y, Z, you've all got to stay at home. And we did, right? But I suspect most of us did it for an emotional reaction to the information, the reason we were given. It wasn't just the reason itself that made most people do it. We all thought, in fact, the media pled with us to do that. Think of your grandmother, think of your father, think of all these people, right?
But the reason, I mean, I thought this was more in your corner, where you had this nice separation between, our visceral, embodied sort of responses, physiological, and then this sort of higher thought. Because the reason for invoking your higher, detached, dispassionate thinking is because we don't always have enough empathy. If you're relying on empathy to help the stranger and you don't have it, that's a bad idea. So you want to say, you've got a reason to do it, whether you empathize or not. So I want you to bring us back to that higher thought and say, what is it doing?
And I mean, so my understanding of how this works, I'm not a cognitive scientist, I should say this completely, disclaimer here, but my understanding of how this works is we are biological organisms, we have reactions to things, and emotions are a critical part of that. We see them in animals, or we know that for ourselves. There are emotions. And we also see it, importantly, temporally across our lives. Children far more emotionally dysregulated than adults, right? So emotion is clearly important. Reason is what sets us apart from other animals as far as we can tell, because we have this ability to externalize this thing that we can describe about the world and pass it from one person to another who might have very different emotional states and emotional beings or reference points, or different parts of the earth have lived very different lives. And reason should stand to reason, right? That's the point of it. And I'm not saying they don't feed back onto each other and that reason doesn't elicit emotion. And I'm not even saying that emotion can't sometimes sneak its way into reason, but pure reason should be divorced from emotion. It should exist in its own right, even when you're not emotional.
I'm going to ask Tommy about pure reason.
Yeah, I'm lost on that distinction. So if we take the examples we've been dealing with and we suggest something like, let's use the homeless person for the example. Let's say that there's a rational process that stands away from emotion, okay? So I see a homeless person, there's some a priori duty to help the homeless person. My question would be, well, what happens when reason doesn't point out that the homeless person should be helped? Is that a failure of reason, or is that just not reason that causes that to happen? So what I'm suggesting is that if I agree that there is a capacity that human beings have to reflect about the world, but what I'm suggesting is that the capacity to do so is not pure reason. It's the same way that we have the capacity to build societies and social hierarchy. The same way ants build anthills, reason seems to be the capacity we have to create justification for social order that don't necessarily, or hardly ever in history, operate individually. We've continually said that it's a capacity that free, autonomous, rational individuals have. But when we go back from Hume to, Kant and all the neo-Kantians, you see that reason has very much a social function, right? It operates within the certain parameters set up by the group. So in the world where the homeless person grabs our attention, our empathy, that's not simply because it does, it's because we have a construct in our social world of a person who has a home and a person who doesn't have a home. And that the person who doesn't have a home is somehow violated by a social norm or individual failure, because our norm is that people should have homes. So there's a normative aspect that pushes reason to kick in. And this is what's interesting in the work that I do on dehumanization. There seems to be a world where the affectivity doesn't kick in reason towards certain groups of people. So then that failure would have to say, if we're going through this separation, the failure would have to say, well, then that's not rational. But we know that is rational, because completely rational, educated, free, autonomous societies have made decisions to group different people into non-beings. So if the social failure of not recognizing something pulls us back to reflect on, well, what then is reason versus emotion, we'd have to say something like, what we take to be a pure reason or a rational argument for X or Y seems to be a more general, to be more located in a general sentiment that groups have about what they want to justify and what they will to structure.
So Tommy, I want to take, that's a very good place to lead on to the second theme about whether we need to step back from and detach ourselves from emotion to make calmer decisions in very important political times. So, we see emotion driving the mob that turned up on January 6th to storm the Capitol. I mean, Julian will say they also had reasons, but emotion, big driver of that. So we have appeals to the law, we have appeals to the Constitution in our politics, which is very divisive, and there's a lot of populist sort of eliciting of sentiment. Isn't it important that we have socially constructed these rules, standards, procedures by which we drop the emotional temperature a little bit? And courts are usually set up because people might want to take the law into their own hands immediately, and you say, well, you're not in a position to make a good judgment here. Let us set up this system where 12 of your peers will decide. So isn't it terribly important to have these dispassionate procedures?
Absolutely, but what I would caution though is that I would think that the procedures we have, like the rule of law, et cetera, are the product of someone's emotion and affectivity. So if you're looking at the United States, for instance, right, the general desire that the state's not taken down by militias and revolutionaries is something that the founding fathers and, you know, the people in power decided, hey, this directly benefits me. And it's the same, works the same way in the United States with the court system. So the way the US court system works is based on stare decisis. So you have a precedent and you make a decision in a case, and that case serves as the rule that you're trying to interpret other cases. And again, this goes back to the fact there are certain popular beliefs that we have, and there's certain people in power have, and then there's a general will to make that the more general rule by which we intuitively grasp these ideas. So on the one hand, I agree, there should be general rules that are not able to be overridden and overthrown simply on individual self-justification or affectivity, right? We agree on that. The question is, does what stands as the rational rule of law or reason itself not the product of those other groups who had the same affectivity towards a disposition?
Yeah.
So in the case with the corporal, you know, when they're storming the Capitol, the funny part about that is they fundamentally believed, you see, because it's not just the rule of law versus the individual in the United States. These white people really did believe that they could storm the Capitol, and because they're white, that they'll be completely fine, right? Because they're supporting Trump. The idea was we support the imperial president, so the imperial president is a justification for our actions, right? They thought it superseded the law, which in America is a completely justifiable reason if you're a certain population. So again, this is what I'm saying. Is that the failure of reason, or is that the operation of reason towards a different end?
Yeah, because they certainly thought they were somehow defending the Constitution more fundamentally than the current government. So Julian, I mean, let's go back to that sort of case. Can we be optimistic that we seek for those pursuits of reason that will allow us to have social order or justice or fairness? Tommy's suggesting it's always in the service of some groups' sort of emotional grounding, but do you have a more optimistic view that, you know, we could actually get something which collectively we could agree to and think, here's justice, here's fairness, based on reason, even if it's motivated initially by emotion?
I think there's been a kind of a philosophical hope that sort of people associate, I think, with people like Plato in particular, that, you know, we can come up with these ideal perfect forms of justice, truth, knowledge, and you know, we can get there eventually. And I think I can't really see that for various reasons. But I don't think we need to worry about that. What we need to think about is direction of travel, right? So in the same kind of way that, could we ever have perfect objectivity and see the world like God's? Well, no, because we're embodied, we have our capacities of our things. But can we become more objective? Well, yes, and we have done. Modern science takes a more objective view of the world than a lot of the sort of its predecessors. And so I kind of think that, you know, I suppose so much of what Tommy says I think is right, and I don't want to misinterpret him, don't get it wrong, but I don't know how much you're sort of saying reason has failed, or whether or not we have failed to use reason to its full potential.
Yeah,
right?
That's what we're trying to get at.
And I think that's the point. Now, I think to its full potential, let's not kid ourselves, right? If we think we can ever reach a stage where we're going to be able to think without all prejudice, cultural conditioning, etc., we're never going to get there. But can we get further that way? I think we can, and I think there are optimistic reasons for saying this. I think that, you know, there's a lot of like kicking of sort of liberal values going on at the moment, fair enough, and maybe it's not even liberal values, but I think the very fact that there has been imperfect progress made in the direction of, you know, anti-racism, anti-sexism and so forth, we shouldn't be at all complacent that we're anywhere near where we ought to be. And you can't even see what's happened as being progress unless you have some kind of fairly optimistic view that by being more rational, and partly the collective thing's important, I think this is the point, which is a slight aside, but I'm quite sort of impressed by sort of trends in psychology, the social cognition model, which has said that we're kind of a little bit hampered by the idea that in the Western philosophical tradition we have sort of thought of reason as being paradigmatically something an individual does alone in their own head. And actually reason has evolved as a function, is a much more social thing. And I think we often make progress, we reach a more rational society partly by having a better collective conversation in which we involve more people than have historically been evolved. So I've gone on a bit too long, Barry, there, but I think the point is, progress in this direction, becoming more rational, becoming more reasonable, is something that, if we don't believe in that, then I think what are we left with? Aren't we just left with a battle of wills to power.
But let's go back to this idea of there being systems that we can try to formulate. And again, I really want to tease out from Güneş this idea. She said, we sort of, get beyond ourselves. We look out. We're using. Is it just special computing power, or does it have a chance to embody some of the kind of negotiation of the sort that we've just been talking about?
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below. Or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.